Hello, and thank you for joining the Christian Democratic Party's web conference discussing the Anti-Discrimination Amendment or the Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill 2020.
I want to welcome everybody to the first Christian Democratic Party Zoom conference for the Anti-Discrimination Religious Freedom Amendment Bill. This is a very exciting time in history. And especially this evening, because we have our special guests, the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile, MLC, and the Honourable Mark Latham, MLC, and also a video message from Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells. We would like to welcome all of those supporters and members in New South Wales for the Christian Democratic Party, but also the supporters and members of the One Nation Party. And we're really pleased to have you all on board. And this has been a conference that's been tried to get together for a number of months, but we're very excited that it has happened at this time to give Mark Latham the support that he needs in the Senate to get this bill through. So first of all, we're going to start off with an introduction with Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, who, as you know, under Philip Ruddock, they've been trying to push and get this bill through in the federal parliament, but it's sitting on the shelves at the moment. And so for those of you, I'm so sorry I didn't introduce myself. I'm Silvana Nile, the wife of Reverend Honourable Fred Nile, for those of you that haven't met me before. So we're going to hear from Conchetta, but before we start, I'm going to give a nice, Reverend Nile's going to give you a welcome and a prayer.
Well, welcome everyone to our special forum by all this modern computer equipment. And we thank Mark for being with us tonight, especially Mark Latham, the Honourable Mark Latham, and thank him for all this support in the Parliament.
A pleasure.
And,
Thanks, Fred.
I thank Savannah for her energy in putting all this together for tonight. So I'll just ask the Lord's blessing. Heavenly Father, we just ask you to bless our forum tonight. Help us to always understand your will and purposes for our society, for our nation, that will be in harmony with you, for your will, for the people of Australia, men and women and children of all backgrounds, all races, all colours, that we are all one under one God. So we just thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight and pray that you'll help us to understand further your will and purposes for our society and what our role is as citizens of Australia, that we're not spectators, but we are involved, Lord, as citizens. So I just pray for your wisdom, guidance and direction now, in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, better known as Connie, couldn't be with us this evening due to other prior commitments. So I'm going to introduce her, but she has done a special video for us. And so we're really looking forward to hear what she has to say with where we're up to with the Religious Freedom Bill in the Federal Parliament. And we'll kick start from here. Senator Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, also known as Connie, practiced law with the Australian Government Solicitor between 1984 to 1990 and was the acting Principal Legal Officer for the Australian Quarantine and Inspection Service in 1990. She has represented the state of New South Wales in the Federal Senate since 2004 and served in the Turnbull government as Assistant Minister for Multicultural Affairs between September 2015 and February 2016. Connie has been a prominent and outspoken conservative voice in the federal politics. She remains an active member of Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy and opposed the legal redefinition of marriage by being one of the 12 senators who voted against what became the Marriage Amendments, the Definition and Religious Freedoms Act of 2017. Fierravanti Wells resigned from the ministry on the 21st of August 2018, and the Liberal Party leaves because of the leadership spill at that time, but remains a voice of traditional values in the federal political arena. Thank you, Honourable Conchita Fierravanti Wells.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can I thank you, Fred, for your kind invitation to join this public forum on religious freedom and liberties. Can I start by commending you, Fred, Mark, and others who have co-sponsored the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Amendment, Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill 2020. Can I particularly thank you, Mark, for the comments that you made in presenting the bill in relation to the delays, the repeated delays by respective New South Wales governments in relation to the protection of religious freedom in this state. The presentation of this bill highlights the importance of state legislation in the whole framework, bearing in mind, as you correctly said, that the proposed federal draft religious discrimination bills do not impact the operation of state law. So what we now have here is a complex myriad of Commonwealth discrimination law, state and territory discrimination law, the combination of which regrettably has resulted in lack of consistency around Australia. And of course that really is the important point here, and this has been the point that I have highlighted in the public comments that I have made. I have been critical of the draft federal bills because I believe that given the existing disparate Commonwealth, state and territory discrimination framework, a better and more long-term solution would be to consolidate discrimination law into a federal legislation to ensure national applicability and consistency of discrimination law, but of discrimination, of the whole myriad of discrimination, including protection of religious freedom. I think that this would afford the equality of rights and conformity to our obligations under international law, and most especially Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. As I have publicly stated, I believe that no bill is better than a flawed bill. However, I do suspect that the federal legislation will now quietly probably be shelved. We do know that the submissions to the federal drafts closed on the 31st of January. That matter is under consideration by the government and the Attorney General. However, given the myriad of COVID-19 legislation which is taking precedence at a federal level, I do not believe that this issue will come to the fore. I think the complexities of this legislation have highlighted that it is a very difficult bill to get through, and I think that there are so many differences of opinion and so many views across the different spectrum that I think it's going to be very difficult to come to a common ground. Can I commend the solidarity of religious leaders? They have, despite their theological differences, they have been unified in their commitment to protect freedom of speech, of thought, of conscience and of religion. They have expressed serious concerns about the first draft, and that led to a revised draft, but it's clear from my discussion with religious leaders that even the second draft does not meet with the requirements for adequate protection of religious freedom. Indeed, can I commend the faith leaders for their joint letter sent to the Prime Minister and to the Attorney General in November last year, where they do state very categorically that in its current form the bills diminish religious freedom of faith groups in Australia. and they took the view that it would be better to have no Religious Discrimination Act than a flawed one. Ultimately, though, it will be the assurances of faith leaders and those assurances that they do give their congregations which will ultimately what they tell their congregations will ultimately influence Australians of family and faith as to whether their expectations about their religious freedom being protected have been met. I mean, commitments were given at the last federal election, and indeed many people voted for the coalition on the in the faith and in the belief that the coalition would be better placed to protect religious freedoms. And ultimately, whatever politicians may say, what matters most to Australians of family and faith is what their congregation leaders tell them, and the assurances that those leaders give them as to whether the expectations of protections have been met. You know, at the kitchen table before the last federal election, people of family and faith were concerned to see what happened in the Folau matter, and it really did bring to the fore the concerns that they have that if they do say something about their religion in their workplace or in any other place, whether they would find themselves in trouble. So we do know that the situation is worsening. We know that there's a growing number of cases where people are facing harassment, intimidation and persecution because of their religious beliefs and their actions, and some are even losing their livelihood. And can I commend those of my colleagues who, like me, have brought these cases to the fore, and it's very important that we continue to advocate for a regime of positive rights that allows people to live in accordance with their convictions. Now, I have raised the concerns that about protection of religious freedom and the fact that we have to ensure that all rights have an equality before the law, and hence my point about the issue of consolidation, because when freedom of speech, thought and conscience and belief are only framed as exemptions, as is the case at the moment, then they are read down against positive rights, rendering them subordinate to those rights, and therefore a regime of positive rights in the form of religious freedom legislation would give greater effect to the right that we all have to manifest our freedom of thought, of conscience, of belief, as most especially outlined by Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So can I come to encouraging all of you to continue to stand up for this very important issue, to participate in the political process, to stick to our guns, to be prepared for the next stages. As I said, at this point in time, given what's happening at a federal level, I would be very surprised to see this legislation progressed, but we do have to be prepared in the event that it is progressed, and we have to be prepared to highlight the continuing deficiencies in the legislation. And so, therefore, please, can I thank you for your ongoing commitment to protection of religious freedoms? Can I again urge you to be politically active in relation to this issue? And can I conclude by wishing you all a very fruitful forum, and I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of your forum. Can I again thank you, Fred, for convening this forum? Can I thank you, Mark, Fred and your co-sponsors for this important bill. But again, I come back to the basic point. We do have a myriad of state legislation, and I think ultimately, unless we bring discrimination under one umbrella and ensure that all rights are treated equally, then I think that we will continue to have problems. And so, whilst it's important at least to ensure proper protections at a state level, and that's an immediate situation. Ultimately, the more long-term and more important solution for the future is to ensure that there is uniformity of protection across Australia, and that will be very much dictated to by one consolidation of discrimination law under one federal umbrella, which will apply right across the states and territories. Good evening to you all, and again, my thanks and best wishes.
Wonderfully executed by Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, and I believe the main points that we need to glean from what she said this evening is that all rights have an equal voice before the law without discrimination. I'll repeat that again. All rights have an equal voice before the law without discrimination. That it is a right that we all have according to Article 18 on the people's rights. So we need to remember we have rights that we need to exercise. We need to have a voice in government. We need to get behind our leaders like Philip Ruddock, Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, Reverend Honourable Fred Nile and Mark Latham, because they are fighting the good fight for us. Just before I introduce Mark, I did want to say Honourable Mark Latham, how much we loved your maiden speech. And I know myself and Annie Wright and Reverend Fred, we mention that wherever we go, we mention you have to listen to Mark Latham's maiden speech. In particular, where you said there were the four most glorious words is to say, I am a Christian. And it really uplifted the spirits of the Christians when we heard that there was a voice in Parliament that was standing for us, other than the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile, as a man of your calibre and position to be able to do that. We can't thank you enough with all our hearts. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And I'm sure it's a sentiment of the Christians that are watching this evening. So our next guest, the Honourable Mark Latham, MLC, has worked for political names like John Kieran, Gough Whitlam and Bob Carr, followed by time serving in local councils and the time in national politics. But also he was the opposition leader of the Australian Labor Party. And before entering the New South, this is what he's achieved before he entered the New South Wales Legislative Council in 2019, representing Pauline Hanson's party, the One Nation Party. The Honourable Mark Latham, MLC, displays a keen interest in the political realm, with a strong focus on education, urban planning, energy, and law reform portfolios. Mark has worked with both sides of Parliament to put the Anti-Discrimination Amendment, Religious Freedom and Equality Bill 2020 before Parliament, which is the topic of today's discussion. We welcome Mark Latham.
Well, thanks very much, Silvana. I really appreciate that. Thank you. And thanks for everyone who's part of the conference, and to the Honourable the Reverend Fred Nile for his co-sponsorship of the bill, which has been very important. Tonight's a chance to have a talk about where the bill came from and what we're hoping to achieve with it, and field any questions about the content of it. And as Connie was saying, it looks like the federal proposed bill from Christian Porter is going to be shelved. We're not likely to see those federal religious freedom and anti-discrimination laws in this term of Parliament. So I think it makes it even more important for the New South Wales Parliament to act. Silvana mentioned my maiden speech in the Legislative Council. Like many people, I've been horrified and never thought I'd see the day in Australia where Christianity is sneered at. Christians like Israel Folau, very high profile, are under attack. It's almost like Christianity is dispensable. It's become a punching bag for people on the extreme of politics to rip in and try and denigrate something. It's part of their broader campaign, of why I said the 4 glorious words in our civilization, I am a Christian. It relates to the fact that these attacks are trying to undermine our Western civilization, and whether you're a Christian or not, we're all very much influenced and guided by the Judeo-Christian ethic that when you look at the definition of right and wrong in society, people wake up in the morning, they live their life, they mightn't appreciate this, but their moral values and their understanding of right and wrong, how we live our lives, is very much guided by the 10 Commandments, by the teachings of Jesus Christ, and they have very happily and properly guided civil society in many of these questions. So the attack on Christianity is part of the fact that Christianity is an essential pillar, an important pillar of our civilization. So to defend our civilization, we've got to defend Christianity and ensure that this era of persecution and discrimination ends. I brought forward the bill acting on the recommendations of the Ruddock Review. After the same-sex marriage decision in Canberra, the government set up the Ruddock Review to have a look at the whole question of religious freedom. And in relation to New South Wales, that committee made 2 very important recommendations. One was that New South Wales should fill the gap in its anti-discrimination laws, because there's lots of categories there, marital status, disability, transgender, sexuality, racial discrimination. None of these groups can be discriminated against at law. And Ruddock said, well, add religious faith to those categories, so that anyone of religious faith or non-faith wouldn't be discriminated against on that basis in New South Wales. And the second recommendation he made was to say, well, effectively, if you put gay rights and religious rights in the one statute, there will be elements of conflict. Sometimes there'll be rights colliding. There'll be public conflict that needs to be sorted out by tribunals and courts. How do you reconcile that? And he made the very useful recommendation to go to the Syracuse principles, legal principles from the Commission of Jurists that flow out of Section 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And basically it says there that religious rights should not be extinguished out of proportion to the issue at hand and out of legislated guidelines about public health, public order and the public interest. So you can't have a situation where you put religious rights into the Anti-Discrimination Bill in New South Wales and automatically they're overridden by gay rights. There needs to be an arbitration mechanism, and my bill, co-sponsored by Fred and others, relies on the Syracuse principles for that purpose. So we don't want to leave this up to judicial officers, some of these left-leaning courts now. We don't want them to decide on that. We've got to set the principles out, the guiding principles, as a parliament, so the courts just don't make arbitrary activist type of decisions. So that's an important part of the bill. The bill itself is based on the template that appears in other parts of the Anti-Discrimination Act 1977 with some additional features that are very important. One of them is the reliance on that international convention. The other is the reliance on the Syracuse principles. The bill doesn't go to the free speech issues that got Christian Porter in trouble in Canberra. He was sort of being attacked by both sides. The lefties were attacking him, of course, but the church organisations weren't very happy with the way in which the bill is framed. I've been doing everything I can to consult with organisations and people of faith to make sure they're happy with the bill, and that process has been really good. We've taken our time, and out of the presentation of my bill in the Legislative Council, the government has set up a joint select committee of the Parliament with representatives of most of the parties and interests to ensure that hopefully there can be a bipartisan position from Labor, Liberal and National to support a bill that is not a subject of great controversy, that it would only have the opposition of the Greens and a few other fringe players in the Parliament. That committee has had one meeting where something very significant happened. Alex Greenwich, the Green independent guy, the author of the abortion bill in the lower house, he wanted to pursue his agenda of having the committee inquiry look at the exemptions, the existing exemptions for religious schools. It would be unacceptable, for instance, if a gay person stood in front of a classroom in a religious school and announced that they were gay and these are the virtues of being gay, and talking to the students that way. They'd have to be sacked. Well, you couldn't allow such a sacked person to then say, oh, I've been discriminated against here on the basis of my sexuality. That's why the exemptions are in place in the existing Act and they need to stay there. So anyway, the committee voted on this. Should our committee look at the existing exemptions or leave them as they are? And Greenwich lost that vote 10-3. So I took that to be a pretty good sign that the committee is common sense and that the extreme agenda that Greenwich wants to pursue, along with the Greens, wasn't supported. 10-3 is pretty conclusive on a committee, and hopefully that will be reflective of the common sense support we can garner for this particular bill. There's two other important aspects I'll mention about the bill, but before that, can I just say, reinforcing the importance of this state legislation, given the fact that the federal bill is unlikely to go ahead. The state jurisdiction in many respects is more important, because if you're a Christian who's been persecuted, discriminated against, or a person of any other faith in New South Wales discriminated against, in New South Wales there are zero cost jurisdictions to go through the Anti-Discrimination Board and also the NCAT, the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, whereas if these complaints were lodged federally, it's very expensive, particularly if you end up in the federal court. So New South Wales, as a no-cost jurisdiction, will provide better access for people of faith discriminated against to pursue their claims and have redress created. So this is very, very important to do this in New South Wales. The Select Committee is up and running, chaired by the Liberal member for Vaucluse and former Attorney General Gabriel Latham. And the two extra things we're looking at in my bill, one of them is to recognise that so many people now in their work arrangements are under employment contracts, and a lot of these contracts are sort of like binding indentures, serfdom type of arrangements, where it's assumed as people sign up to the contract that everything they do away from the workplace somehow is part of the corporate brand, the corporate image. And this is where Israel Folau was attacked so grievously, in that it's assumed that if you declare your Christian faith away from the workplace and people object to that, you've done something to damage the corporate brand, in this case Rugby Australia, and we know the complaints they had from their sponsors like Qantas. So what my bill does in section 22N is say that a religious activity performed by the employee that occurs at a time other than when the employee is performing work and a place other than the employer's place of work, and doesn't include any direct criticism or attack on or cause any direct and material financial detriment to the employer, that's a protected activity. You can't be sacked or disciplined in the workplace because away from work you declared yourself to be a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu and spoke about that faith and what it means to you, effectively what Folau did. And in defining direct and material financial detriment, we make it clear that this does not include boycotts, secondary boycotts like the one that Israel Folau experienced, or the withdrawal of sponsorship, which also was in the Folau case. So that's a very important labour law protection. I mean, the Labor Party used to talk about the rights of workers. Well, workers have got the right to articulate their religious beliefs and faith away from the workplace in a way that doesn't impact on the company. And if they do that, they shouldn't be subject to discipline or dismissal from their job. So we say that that's a form of discrimination, and I think that's a really important thing to do in this particular bill. And the second item, the final item of importance in the bill, is to note at 22M that we're exempting what we call religious ethos organisations. Religion is different to other areas of possible discrimination, because where does religious faith begin and end? Religious faith is more than going to church on a Sunday. It's obviously part of the life, the faith, the existence of many people. So what we've done there is say that a religious ethos organisation, like a religious school, a religious charity, they would be exempted from this bill, because we don't want, again, someone missing out, say an Anglican applies for a job in a Catholic church, or an atheist and says, oh, I missed out because I was, a Catholic school, I missed out employment at the Catholic school because I'm an atheist or a person of other faith. Well, we don't want those schools caught up in litigation and recidivist complaints to the Anti-Discrimination Board. So, and there's another aspect of that. In Queensland, there was a ridiculous decision made there that when the Queensland chapter of the St Vincent de Paul Society said they wanted to have a Catholic as the president, that was challenged in their tribunal and ruled that that was a form of discrimination. Well, I think most people would recognise that if St Vincent de Paul, practising Catholic faith through the welfare arm, wants to have a Catholic president, that's only fair and reasonable, and they shouldn't be subject to action in an anti-discrimination tribunal. So, Silvana, that's the guts of what we're trying to achieve here. This is a complex area of law. The bill won't please everyone, but I'm hopeful we can get a good majority and bipartisanship in the Parliament to have it supported and ensure that these key provisions are backed in, because they will make a difference. What it basically means for people of faith, that if you're discriminated against, you can take action. But I think also importantly, it tells all the sneering bigots and anti-religion mob out there in society that you've got to think twice, three times about what you're on about, because you could end up breaking the law. So that unseen aspect of protecting people is important too. So I'm very keen on this bill. I'm hopeful we can get it through, and I think it's very important work for the fairness of our society in New South Wales.
Well, Mark, God bless you for being a champion of the Religious Freedom and Anti-Discrimination Amendment. This is wonderful. It's such a blessing. Just to highlight a few of the points there, that as Mark stated, we are guided by our Judeo-Christian ethics in our community. So it doesn't matter if we wake up as a Christian or not a Christian, our morals and values in this society and in our community as a nation are based on the Ten Commandments. And as rightly said, as Mark said, we are guided by Jesus Christ in this, and all our Judeo-Christian history comes from that. The whole federation was based on that we humbly rely on the blessings of Almighty God, and that was Sir Edmund Barton in his preamble had stipulated that. So our religious beliefs should not be extinguished, as Mark Latham has just said. We need to be a voice. We need to be setting principles in government so that the left-wing groups like the Arbitrary Commission don't rule us out. And so we do have rights as workers, and as Conchetta Fierravanti well stipulated very well, that all rights have an equal voice, that nobody's rights should overrule somebody else's belief systems. And thank you, Mark, for being there for us and being a champion of the cause. God bless you again. We do move now on to the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile. And the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council on the 19th of September 1981 with 9.1% of the vote as the founder of the Christian Call to Australia Fred Nile Group, which was established in 1977. He is the longest serving member of the New South Wales Parliament and is currently the founder and the leader of the Christian Democratic Federal Party. His political triumphs include an extensive career in Christian witness and advocacy. His political triumphs include in 1964, he was ordained as an evangelical congregational minister. From 1964 to 1967, Reverend Nile was the National Director of the Australian Christian Endeavour Movement, and which is a Protestant youth leadership training organisation. In 1967 to 68, he was the director of the Billy Graham Crusade in Sydney before being employed as the director of the Congregational Board of Evangelism in New South Wales. In 1970-71, he was director of the Methodist Mission to the people of New South Wales from 1971 to 1973, and he was the director of Outreach Evangelism, Sydney City Wesley Central Mission, and Reverend Nile has been an outspoken defender of religious liberties and freedom of conscience, while also protecting the rights of the unborn and the integrity of the family unit in his political career. And just for those of you who don't know, he doesn't usually put this in his introduction, but Reverend Nile was also a captain in the Australian Reserves as well for 20 years. So God bless you, Reverend Fred Nile. Over to you.
Thank you, Savannah Nile. Thank you for organising tonight, and I thank again Mark Latham for his courage in introducing the Religious Freedom Bill. The full title is the Anti-Discrimination Amendment, Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill 2020. I did introduce a similar bill back, I think, in 2018, just a Religious Freedom Bill. And I'm very pleased he took up the mantle and has put up this bill, which is getting widespread support and has more chance of being passed than probably anything that I would do. So I thank you, Mark, for your initiative and courage in introducing the Anti-Discrimination Amendment, Religious Freedoms and Equality Bill. And you've already mentioned a couple of the features of that bill. Some of them are obvious, which I'm very happy with in your bill. Section 22N has been already mentioned, discrimination in work. It's unlawful for an employer under this bill to discriminate against a person on the ground of religious beliefs or religious activities. And that comes right down to Israel Hillel. He's one example, and of course Margaret Court, and there are others as well. Mark's bill also is very strong in making it unlawful for a person, for a principal to discriminate against a contract worker on the grounds of religious beliefs or religious activities. It also makes it unlawful for an industrial organisation, that's like a trade union, to discriminate against a person who is not a member of the industrial organisation on the grounds of religious beliefs or religious activities. Mark's bill also has in it special protection in the area of education. It is unlawful for an educational authority to discriminate against a person on the ground of religious beliefs or religious activities. Also, in the area of accommodation, renting accommodation, joining religious clubs, and so on. All those areas are protected by Mark Latham's bill, for which we're very grateful. And we're looking forward in anticipation to it being passed. There was talk about the federal area, the religious discrimination federal situation, and I think our strategy is probably the right one to get a strong bill passed on state level in New South Wales as a model, and with the support that we'll get, that would then put more pressure on the federal parliament, the federal government, to adopt a similar bill in due course. We've already done this in a number of other areas, is to break it down into vitable amounts that we can achieve success. Let's get Mark's bill passed, and then we can put pressure on the federal government to adopt a Mark's bill on the federal level as well. And we'll have a lot more chance of that happening if it goes through the state parliament with strong support. So all the best to you, Mark. Keep up the good work.
And,
thanks, Fred. Thanks
thank you so much. Thank you. Reverend Honourable Fred Nile has said it and put it quite aptly, that we want to create a wave from New South Wales to go right across our states, and when all the states come together, we're able to put that pressure then on the federal parliament, because when we're successful, and I believe we're going to be, because we can feel there's an energy and a presence there, and Mark, you're going to have all the Christians praying for you. So we know that you're going to get a lot of support with angels and blessings that will enable you. So we don't want to cut into the question time now. So Tom Harris, who is the Secretary of the Christian Democratic Party, is going to lead conduct the question forum. Thank you, Tom Harris. Over to you.
Thank you, Silvana. Mark Latham, who were the other two who voted with Greenwich?
Jenny Leong, who is the Greens member for Newtown, and unfortunately Paul Lynch, who's the Labor representative for the seat of Liverpool and also the Shadow Attorney General. But some other Labor representatives on the committee voted the right way to say that the existing exemptions for religious schools shouldn't be subject of the inquiry. And I think the Labor position is very interesting, because obviously the Labor Party these days got very close ties to the LGBTIQ alphabet community, and but it's also true that in their Western Sydney seats in particular, where they've relied on strong ethnic vote, a lot of those ethnic groups are saying, well, hang on, there's been support there, but on same-sex marriage, it's one example. The Labor representatives went the other way, and they're wanting them to look after the rights of those ethnic groups. I get a lot of feedback from ethnic groups, representatives, people, citizens who say they came to Australia to get away from religious persecution. How come it's followed them here to Australia? And where are the protections for that? So it's become a very important issue. You know, Labor people can dress up for these functions and say they're supportive, but here's a real test to support very important protections at law that are significant, highly significant to people of faith from an ethnic background, particularly in those Labor seats.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. There's a question that's an open question, so whichever of you feels like answering can answer. Are Christian schools being informed about this? In other words, principals and parents, including Catholic schools. I'm assuming they're talking about the bill. And so do either of you want to answer that?
Well, the committee has sent out all the information to the peak religious school organisations, Catholic, Anglican, Islamic, and so forth, the Christian schools. So all that information's gone out, and it's open for public submissions. I expect, you know, the peak school bodies will make submissions about this, representing their schools. And for everyone part of this seminar, the submissions close next Friday, and all the information is available on the New South Wales Parliament website. If you go to the committees there, you'll see the committee established to look into this bill, and you'll see your opportunity to make a submission and have your voice heard.
Thank you. Another question here. Does the Bajelkian government support the bill? How can we put pressure on them to support the bill? Very good question.
Well, the pressure was to set up the select committee. I was on the select committee for the lockout laws in Sydney, which is very effective in arriving at a bipartisan position to take the politics and controversy out of it. And I thought, well, that would be a good thing to do on religious freedom. And I think the Berejiklian government's attitude is, particularly after the fiasco with the abortion bill, and in particular the National Party, that didn't cover themselves in glory in their voting pattern there, they need to make sure that voices of faith are heard in the system, respected, consulted, and we don't, you know, this has been the opposite of the abortion bill, which was pushed through so quickly. And I think the government's attitude is that they don't want a political bun fight over this. They would like the committee to lead the process, arrive at a consensus or a bipartisan position, and then move it through the parliament on that basis. So the committee does the work rather than the cabinet doing the work, which is what happened with the Sydney lockout laws as well. So, you know, Joint Select Committee of the Parliament is a bit more prestigious than your normal parliamentary committees, and the Charter is there to reach a consensus position and have big majority support in both houses to get this through.
Yeah.
Thank you, Reverend Nile. I know you're quite big on safe schools. There's a question. Is there any way that this bill can affect the safe schools legislation in New South Wales?
Safe schools.
Yes, the education system, the safe schools policy. Sorry, not bill.
Yeah, there's no safe schools legislation.
No.
The Premier, the state government actually has banned safe schools in New South Wales, but the Teachers Federation and many teachers are still teaching it and introducing it into their schools. And the state government has to make up its mind to discipline those teachers and say you're teaching material which is no longer officially approved for educational purposes. It only confuses the children, and we know that for a fact with this gender neutrality, and you can be a male or a female. Not many years ago, you'd have 5 children going to a special children's hospital with confusion over their sexuality. Now you can have 150 children, and that to me is the evidence that any safe school propaganda only confuses the children about their gender. So that's why it should not be taught in our state schools.
Thank you. There's another question which I'll leave this open to either of you to answer. Any suggestions what are the most important things to emphasise when making a submission?
Well, obviously support for the bill, but also support for the Ruddock recommendations. Yeah, this hasn't come out of nowhere. Those Ruddock recommendations are very important. The legislation is needed. The Syracuse principles are important. And to emphasise examples of discrimination, why the protections are needed, and also to emphasise, I mean, there's some dreadful propaganda out there. I mean, Alex Greenwich and this outfit called Equality Australia, they're not about equality. They are propagandists sort of on a Stalinist scale. They just make stuff up to denigrate and attack this bill. I know, Fred, you would have heard the propaganda of these groups over the years. They don't attend to the facts or rational argument. So people making submission can truthfully point out that this bill is not about taking away the rights of the gay community. It's not an attack on the gay community. And unfortunately, this Equality Australia mob, they were part of the same-sex marriage push. They've got a business model of scaring the gay community and asking for donations, which is pretty shocking. And we should just be emphasising this is a bill that adds a new category to stop discrimination in New South Wales and don't take away any of the rights of the groups that are already in the Anti-Discrimination Act, which has been there since 1977. It's not about that at all. It's a new protection and should be supported on that basis.
I agree with that, Mark. That's 100%. So the churches should have quick meetings and get their letters into the committee expressing their strong support for Mark Latham's bill.
Excellent. This one's a slightly more technical question. Under clause 22K of the bill, does natural law fall under the bill's definition of religious belief, which includes non-religious belief?
22.
Is that one that can be answered?
Sorry, natural law meaning... I'm not familiar with the technical meaning of natural law, but I can say that religious belief is defined here as having a religious conviction, belief, opinion or affiliation, or not having a religious conviction, belief, opinion or affiliation. So it's those of faith and those not of faith. And we looked at this in the drafting of the bill. You can try and codify what a religious belief is, but generally it's been found in statute law, this is very hard to do, but there's a definition of religious belief used in the High Court of Australia, which the courts and the parliaments essentially rely on. So if in doubt about the definitions of religious belief and what is a religious organisation, then the tribunals and courts in New South Wales will fall back on that High Court ruling, because there's a lot of grey areas, you know. Do you include Scientology, for example? That's one prominent example. So natural law, if it's part of someone's non-faith, it could be covered depending on the interpretation of the High Court decision.
That's correct. In the bill, as you know, Mark, it's your bill, it makes it clear religious beliefs means having a religious conviction, beliefs, opinion or affiliations, genuinely believe in relation to a person means the person holding of the religious belief is sincere and is not fictitious, capricious or an artifice. So it's quite clear, the legislation and its definitions.
Yeah, I'm just looking up on my phone natural law. I suppose that's the meaning of humanism, that human beings possess intrinsic values that govern our reasoning and behaviour. Yeah, well, that's covered. That's a form of non-belief, a humanist perspective. It basically means that you know, you can't be discriminated on the basis of not having religious faith, which is in many respects just as important as outlawing discrimination against those of faith.
Sorry. Is it the right of conscience for medical practitioners protected in your bill?
Is the right of conscience of medical practitioners protected in the bill? There are protections for them in the gaining of their qualifications, that you wouldn't be able to rub someone out of a medical school because they're of religious belief. You wouldn't be able to turn someone away from a hospital because of their religious belief or any other health service provider. But the bill itself is not undoing what was voted down by the Parliament in the abortion debate to establish a right of conscience for medical practitioners. I took the view in drafting the bill that we couldn't unpick things that have happened in the past, because that would obviously generate controversy and probably contribute to the bill not passing. So if the Parliaments, federal and state, have made decisions in the past, there's nothing in this bill that unpicks them, but there are protections there for people of faith who go into the medical profession.
Excellent. Thank you.
A qualifying body like the AMA couldn't just deregister a doctor because that person was of faith. That would be discrimination. Or a college of surgeons, something like that. You know, a qualifying accreditation body couldn't discriminate on the basis of faith.
Thank you. There's one person who says, I'm concerned about people's freedom to seek out counselling services in line with their religious beliefs and parents' right to seek out help for their children in line with their faith. Do you believe that that will be further supported with this bill?
Well, there are protections there. If you had children with whatever the particular issue is and you sought out a counselling service and they said, no, we can't provide our service to you because you're of a religious faith, then that's discrimination. And you've got redress through the tribunal and possibly the courts.
Excellent. Thank you.
There's lots of ways you can discriminate against people in our society, you know. I mean, every time I have a session like this, there's new aspects that are raised There's probably hundreds of ways you can discriminate against people of faith, and this bill knocks them all out.
Excellent. And we're coming to the end of time. We've got one more question. Do parents have the right to take their children out of offensive education?
Well, that's not a matter covered by this bill, but I do have a separate parental rights bill that I introduced in our last sitting week to say that the point Fred was making about safe schools, that gender fluidity teaching, course development and teacher training in New South Wales should be outlawed, and there should be a parental right of consultation that my bill proposes at the beginning of every school year. The school sets out all the contentious issues of parental primacy, moral, ethical, social, political content, and the parents know about it, they're consulted about it. The school only proceeds if there's a level of parental support, and parents then have the specific right of taking their kids out of courses where they're not comfortable with the values and the moral dimension that's being pushed upon their children. I've just earlier this evening a phone call from a parent in country New South Wales where the kids have been taught Black Lives Matter material in English class under the banner of equality. I mean, the politicisation of our schools is just phenomenal and unacceptable. What Black Lives Matter and teaching about equality has got to do with English, and as the parent pointed out, the child's basic skills are still got a lot of development to go. Why don't they teach the basics instead of pushing political propaganda and indoctrination upon 13-year-olds?
Yes, Mark, I commend you on your second bill, the one you're talking about now, Education Legislation Amendment Parental Rights Bill 2020, and I'll give that all my support I can. Make sure we get that passed through the Parliament as well. And that'll fix up making it clear that parents do have rights over their children's education, values and beliefs.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks for your support. I hope we can get majority support, but I think it's going to be a tougher battle than this one.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Tom, thank you for your excellent execution of conducting the question forum. There's 167 questions that have not been answered, and I'd like to give that opportunity for all those people, and Reverend Nile has said this previously, for those questions that are for the Honourable Mark Latham's office, please send them to his parliamentary office, and also for those questions for the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile, please do send them to Reverend Nile's office at New South Wales Parliament. We thank both the Honourable Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, we thank the Honourable Mark Latham, we thank the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile, because it's all about transparency, and with champions such as these, and the fact that the Christians are lifting their voices, and under the Syracuse principles, and not having discrimination to be not being able to get a position on organisations, medical organisations like the AMA, we must stand up. This is a time when we have the wonderful champions like Mark Latham, who is standing up for our Christian causes. It would be a shame that Christians wouldn't be standing up at this time for their causes. And so we have this opportunity now where we have voices in Parliament, but we need our voices out there as well.
Amen.
So God bless you. Do speak up diplomatically and with love, and being proactive and not reactive. And we can be advocates of the truth, and our Judeo-Christian principles can be upheld in this nation. So God bless you. We thank one and all. We thank you for your participation, your questions, your support, and your love for the champions of the cause, and give them your prayers and your support wherever you can. God bless you, Honourable Mark Latham and Reverend Nile and Conchetta Feravanti Wealth, and keep up the great work. We're right behind you in prayer.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. It's been an excellent session. Thanks, Silvana. Thanks, Fred, and everyone else.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Good evening.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening, everyone.